Yeah, which brings me neatly to the title of your book, Diversity and Exclusion. And then the cover featured the word inclusion being crossed out. And so my first question is, I think, a three-pronged one. Who is doing the excluding? Who is being excluded? And on what basis do they rely to exclude people?
Yeah, so the people being excluded are anyone who is open to different viewpoints, because the title is really a comment on diversity ideology in universities.
Hmm.
So, I don't think we have to rehash the Laurier scenario because people can read the book.
Of course.
But I was when I was found myself in a disciplinary meeting, one of the people there was a diversity office bureaucrat,
Hmm.
and it was then when I kind of learned what diversity, inclusion, equity offices do on campus. And what they do is they are there to enforce ideological conformity. They're there to ensure that you have the approved viewpoints, that you have the correct viewpoints.
Hmm.
That is the reason they're there. And so if you prove to be one of the people who has an incorrect opinion,
Hmm.
uh, or you're just maybe open to hearing about those different opinions, then you will find yourself on the outs and you will find yourself not being, they actually don't want to include you in their ideology of inclusion. They want you out and away.
Of course, yeah. In my experience, political movements and ideologies that base themselves on a sense of exclusion, they never work and they always divulge into something incredibly toxic. And it's I'm glad you mentioned the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter thing, because both statements are in itself correct. Um, well, one includes more than the other, and I do find it staggering how, all lives matter is being used or being seen as a sort of like a reactionary racist stuff against, the correct movement. And I want to ask you, what in your view are the quote unquote correct views being enforced by, say, the people of Laurier and as well as, say, any other university, mine included.
So you have to believe that Canada is a systemically racist country that was founded on genocide of Indigenous people. So that
Hmm.
is something you have to believe in and repeat. You have to believe that if you're not Indigenous, then you're a uninvited guest on Indigenous lands.
Hmm.
Um, you have to believe that trans women are women, and therefore, even if they are biological males, they
Hmm.
should be in women's prisons and women's spaces, women's shelters. And you have to, go along with pronouns. Those offices, they like to put pronouns. I remember seeing in the gym change room, just, stuff about respecting pronouns. They really like to enforce that.
Hmm.
And you have to be pro-choice. If you're a pro-life person, then you're trying to control women's bodies, stuff like that. So those are just some of the examples of the correct viewpoints.
Yeah, of course. Um, I mean, regardless of how you consider the merits of whichever the opinions espoused by, I guess, what you would call the left-wing orthodoxy. I mean, you may believe them or you may not, but the extent to which they demonize and villainize and exclude the people who believe otherwise, who do not really buy into much of their stuff, I find it to be very staggering. Which brings me to, um, I guess, the idea of postmodernism, because I think the sort of like what that Montreal professor Gatsat calls the diversity, inclusivity, and equity religion, or DIE, finds its roots in postmodernism. And can you tell me, you were in communication studies, correct?
Yeah. So in my communication degree, when I was doing my undergrad, there was a lot of Marx, but there
Hmm.
wasn't necessarily, there was a lot of Michel Foucault.
Oh,
Actually,
yeah.
that's often the fundamental, yeah,
Hmm.
theorist of these programs. But it wasn't until I did I entered my grad program, which was in cultural analysis and social theory,
Hmm.
where I encountered all these other postmodern theorists, like Deleuze, Jacques Derrida,
Hmm.
again, more Foucault, that I really started to question, what am I even reading? Is there any substance here? And
Hmm.
I just became it was really difficult because when you see yourself as a good student and you've made it into grad school and all of a sudden you're like, I'm not seeing the point in these readings of these
Hmm.
theorists that I'm supposed to be upholding, and I'm supposed to be seeing them as so important, and
Yeah.
I'm just not seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing. And so it was at that point where I started, just Googling, why is my grad program all about Marx and postmodernism? And although I had heard of Jordan Peterson before,
Hmm.
it was kind of at that point where uh, I watched one video of him and Camille Paglia. Have you
Oh,
ever
yeah.
watched the one I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, I know of her. She has a great book called Break, Blow, Burn about poetry, which you really should check out.
Okay. So I watched, a 2-hour discussion between Peterson and Paglia, and I was like, wow, like finally two people are ripping apart these postmodern theorists.
Hmm.
And it was then when I kind of became more comfortable with my instinct, which was that there's nothing to the postmodernists. It's very empty. It's intellectually empty. And finally, when I heard Peterson and Paglia talking about it, it kind of confirmed that. And I was just happy to hear other professors
Hmm.
saying it.
Yeah. My point about Michel Foucault, whose name is mentioned a lot in my own classes as well. I'm a Trent University student, and I'm in English literature. Uh, Somehow he makes it into the curriculum, but I think he's more popular in the culture studies stuff. Um, my opinion of him is largely derived from a book by Sir Roger Scruton, a British philosopher, called Thinkers of the New Left. Um, I think his conclusion is that even though Foucault himself has several pretty interesting ideas, um, he reaches these conclusions, which are obviously, it's a very radical take on anti-establishmentism, and he thinks that all the social norms that we have, quote unquote, taken for granted, like say family and hospitals and prisons, are all, to borrow a phrase from Louis Althusser, ideological state apparatuses used by one dominant power group to, subject another, like, group that doesn't have power, and which is very ironic because around the end of his life, Foucault contracted AIDS, and he needed the help of hospitals as well as the kindness of people who he sees as cold-blooded power grabbers.
Um, yeah, so, and the idea that power works through us, not at us, that was often repeated. You're probably more in tune with that stuff. Ever since I graduated, I'm so glad I don't have to engage with that material anymore.
Mhm.
I read Douglas Murray's Madness of Crowds.
Love
If
that
you've read
book.
that.
Yeah.
And he kind of goes into the
Hmm.
postmodernists, and I just have to skip through it because it kind of triggers me.
Oh yeah. It's funny because his one of his criticisms of the postmodernists, especially say the Judith Butler type, is that their writing is so opaque and obscure. But then when it comes to the subject of power relations and capitalism, and if you are say a feminist, the patriarchy, uh, they make it very clear what they are up to, and which one of the things that really disturbed me, aside from the very much a revisionist history of the foundations of this country that we both live in, is, as I bring it back to the postmodernists, the repudiation and rejection of everything that, say, the fruits of the Enlightenment, the fruits of rationality and science and humanism. Yeah, can you speak more about that?
What I see more of is a rejection of, I don't know. No, I can't really speak more on that.
I mean, you were on at the epicenter of.
Sorry, I just have to. My husband's making noise. I have to tell him to stop.
As I said, as I was saying, you were at of course, an epicenter of a very much a concerted internet and even a real life campaign against you, because you were willing to engage an idea that is not part of the orthodoxy, namely the Jordan Peterson video. So were there any like physical encounters that displeased you at that time?
What do you mean?
Like in person, I mean, like not off the internet, like someone came to you and say awful things about you and all that.
Do you mean after the controversy had transpired and when I was on campus?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there were, so after I went through the controversy, I started a free speech club called the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. And it was just to, because I truly did believe in the value of open inquiry and free discussion on campus. And I wanted to see if Laurier would champion that value of free expression by letting us host events that, presented non-mainstream views or unorthodox views. And, we had protests to our events. In one case, we invited Dr. Frances Widdowson, who's a professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, and she is outspoken against indigenization. Right. So just the idea that there are indigenous ways of knowing, and she sees that as antithetical to science, like she believes in the scientific method as a way to pursue knowledge. And the idea that you have to value indigenous ways of knowing just because they're indigenous, she sees as, hindering truth seeking. So we invited her to talk about that. And even though she's a Canadian professor talking on a university campus, this was in May 2018, the university, Laurier, charged us over $5,000 just to host her because there was going to be a protest. So effectively, we had to pay for protesters to protest our event. And we did fundraise the money on GoFundMe. Mm-hmm. So it was thanks to the people who donated that we were able to host that event, because I couldn't come up with $5,000, And yeah, there was protest. I mean, they yell things at you, but it's kind of there's not much substance to it. Like they would just yell, fuck you, everybody hates you. Mm-hmm. Okay, I mean that's not any substantial criticism, so whatever. Yeah, but there's more in the book though for people who read it. There's some interesting encounters. Yeah.